This is not a story about migration. It is a story about how a democratic country suspended international law and got away with it. Finland, ranked the happiest country on earth for 7 consecutive years, a founding pillar of the post-war humanitarian order, a country that signed the 1951 Refugee Convention, built its legal system around rule of law, and spent decades positioning itself as a model of Nordic stability and openness. In December 2023, it closed its entire 1,340-kilometer border with Russia. Every crossing, every point of entry, shut down completely, not because of a war on Finnish soil, not because of a mass exodus threatening to overwhelm the country, because roughly 1,300 people arrived at remote border crossings, many of them on bicycles. And 7 months later, the Finnish parliament passed a law that lets border guards reject asylum claims on the spot, without processing, without appeal, without judicial review, without exception. The question is not whether Finland had the right to protect its border. The question is what happens to the entire European asylum system when this template spreads. And it already has. For 72 years, Finland played a very specific game: military neutrality. Careful, deliberate distance from both NATO and the Soviet bloc. A 1,340-kilometer land border with Russia, managed not through confrontation, but through pragmatism. Through the Paasikivi Doctrine, the idea that Finland could coexist with a powerful neighbor by avoiding provocation. It worked. For decades, it worked remarkably well. Finland maintained sovereignty, built one of Europe's strongest welfare states, and kept the peace on its eastern frontier without joining a military alliance. Then, February 24th, 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine, and Finland's entire strategic calculation collapsed overnight. The neutrality that had protected Finland for 72 years suddenly looked like a liability. If Russia was willing to invade a neighboring country, a non-aligned Finland was not safe. It was simply next in line without allies. In April 2023, Finland joined NATO. The decision ended more than 7 decades of military neutrality. The longest EU land border with Russia, 1,340 kilometers, became a NATO alliance frontier overnight. Moscow's response was immediate. Not military, not diplomatic, structural. By late 2023, border guards at remote eastern crossing points began reporting something they hadn't seen before. Migrants, mostly from Syria, Iraq, Yemen, and Somalia, arriving in organized groups on the Russian side of the border, not walking up from nearby Russian cities where they had been living, being delivered, transported directly to the crossing points in what appeared to be coordinated movements. Some carried Russian transit visas that seemed purpose-issued specifically for border crossing. The timing was precise. The organization was documented. Finnish border guards filmed convoys arriving on the Russian side. Local journalists reported the same. Within weeks, roughly 1,300 asylum seekers had arrived at crossing points that normally processed a handful of cases per month. In Valmiera, a community of barely 100 people, migrants suddenly outnumbered residents. Local officials scrambled. School gymnasiums became makeshift shelters. Food and supply chains strained. Processing systems that were never designed for this volume collapsed almost immediately. Helsinki recognized the pattern fast, because Finland had watched it happen before, not on its own border, but on Poland's. In 2021, Belarusian President Lukashenko flew thousands of migrants from the Middle East into Minsk and systematically funneled them toward the Polish border. It was a deliberate pressure tactic. Punishment for EU sanctions and Polish support for Belarusian opposition movements. A weapon made of people. Finland's Interior Minister Mari Rantanen named it immediately instrumentalized migration, the deliberate use of human beings as a geopolitical tool. Prime Minister Peter Orpo went further, describing it as an organized attempt to destabilize the Finnish state. Moscow denied everything. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov called the accusations completely unsubstantiated. The documentation said otherwise. On November 18, 2023, Finland shut 4 eastern border crossings. The flow redirected to the remaining open points. Finland closed more. then more again. On December 15, 2023, the government made a decision with no modern precedent in European history. The entire land border with Russia closed, all 1,340 kilometers, every single crossing point. The only thing left open was one freight rail line at Vaalimaa. After March 2024, the Finnish Interior Ministry recorded 0 new arrivals. Not a reduction. 0. The closure worked, but it created a new problem. A temporary border shutdown is an emergency measure. It cannot last forever. Trade needs to move. Diplomatic channels need to function. And under international law, you cannot permanently close a border to asylum seekers without a legal framework to justify it. Third, indefinite renewal. The law was framed as temporary. It could only be activated in specific border zones and had to be renewed monthly. But renewal required only one thing: the government declaring the situation a crisis. There was no defined threshold, no independent review of whether the crisis still existed. As long as the Interior Minister said the threat was high and unpredictable, the law stayed active. In March 2025, Parliament voted to extend it through the end of 2026. The justification was identical to the one used in 2024. The threat remains high and unpredictable. The temporary measure had become permanent policy. The numbers that followed were structural and immediate. Asylum applications collapsed 45%. Finland received over 5,300 applications in 2023. In 2024, fewer than 3,000. Despite ongoing conflicts in Syria, Afghanistan, and Ukraine that were driving displacement across the rest of Europe. Deportation orders jumped 64% to 1,965. But the most revealing detail was this: the Pushback Law had never actually been used. As of mid-2025, Finnish officials confirmed it had not been applied in practice. Not once, because it didn't need to be. The border was already closed. The legal threat of immediate rejection was enough. The knowledge that arriving at a Finnish border crossing meant instant return, no hearing, no appeal, no process, was sufficient to redirect the flow entirely. Would-be asylum seekers didn't come. Or they went somewhere else. Reports emerged within months. Smuggling networks had redirected toward Poland and Lithuania, countries already under identical pressure from Belarus and Russia. Finland had not solved the problem. It had externalized it, pushed the human cost onto its neighbors and onto the people now stuck in legal limbo in Russia and Belarus, countries where many of them faced the very persecution they were trying to escape. Compare this to Poland's response in 2021. Warsaw faced roughly 4,000 arrivals at the Belarus border and passed pushback legislation. Lithuania followed in 2022. Latvia in 2023. Each government cited instrumentalized migration. Today the border is silent. Drone footage shows snow-covered forests, empty crossing points, border guards patrolling with dogs. No migrants, no arrivals, no crisis. By every official metric Finland uses to measure the situation. The Finnish government calls this a success. The border is secure. Hybrid warfare has been deterred. Control has been maintained. But the EU has not intervened in any meaningful way. The Council of Europe criticized the law as insufficiently justified. The European Commission expressed concern about compatibility with EU asylum rules. Neither body imposed consequences. Neither initiated legal proceedings. The law stood. The border stayed closed. In 2024, the EU introduced new crisis regulations giving member states limited exemptions from standard asylum procedures during declared emergencies. Finland processed 1,300 arrivals and declared a national emergency. Germany absorbed over 1 million asylum seekers in a single year. 2015. Sweden took in 163,000 that same year. Finland has functioning institutions, EU support, and a population of 5.6 million with the infrastructure to process far larger numbers. The difference was political will, and the political opportunity created by a nationalist coalition that had been pushing for tighter immigration controls for years before a single bicycle appeared at Vaalimaa. And that is the precedent that matters. not the border closure itself. Countries have closed borders before. The precedent is the legal architecture built around it. The mechanism that can be activated by ministerial declaration, renewed indefinitely without independent review, and exported to any EU member state willing to use the same framing. Italy is experimenting with offshore processing in Albania. Denmark passed legislation allowing deportations to undefined third countries. The UK attempted to transfer asylum seekers to Rwanda. Each of these governments pointed to Finland. Each said they did it first. The EU accepted it. So can we. Finland's problem was not 1,300 migrants. It was a political coalition that needed a crisis, and a crisis that arrived at exactly the right moment. The border closure is not a temporary response to hybrid warfare. It is a legal framework designed from the beginning to be permanent, renewable, and transferable to any country willing to declare an emergency. The 1951 Refugee Convention was built on a single principle. The right to seek asylum is unconditional, not conditional on the political context, not suspendable when a hostile power is involved, not negotiable when a government finds the numbers inconvenient. Finland suspended that principle. The EU accepted the suspension. Other governments are now building on it. This is not a story about Finland. It is a story about what happens when the exception becomes the rule, and the institutions designed to prevent that look the other way.